You hear the cheering first. Torches cast dancing shadows across marble columns as hundreds of voices surge outside the chamber door. You're 15 years old. Your hands won't stop shaking. The silk of your wedding gown feels suddenly too thin, too revealing, as servants press their ears against the wood, waiting. They're not here to protect you. They're here to witness, to verify, to judge. And somewhere in this room, hidden behind painted frescoes or carved into the architecture itself, others are watching too. This isn't your wedding night. This is your trial, and the verdict will be written in blood. Before we go deeper into what happened behind those doors, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? It's incredible that stories buried for 2,000 years still reach us. Drop your location in the comments. The year is 23 AD. The palace complex sprawls across Rome's Palatine Hill, where emperors have turned marriage into statecraft and intimacy into public property. The young woman trembling in that chamber isn't just any bride. She's a queen by title, a political asset by function, and tonight, a specimen under examination. Her name appears in fragmentary records, mentioned once by Tacitus, described in passing by Suetonius, but her terror, that's preserved in letters, medical texts, and the brutal architecture of Roman law itself. Because what's about to unfold in that room has been sanctioned by centuries of tradition, blessed by priests, and enforced by an empire that views a woman's body as evidence to be authenticated, territory to be conquered, and machinery to be tested. How did one of history's most sophisticated civilizations design wedding customs that functioned like torture? How did queens' women who wore purple, commanded servants, and ate from golden plates become prisoners on the night meant to celebrate their elevation? The door closes. The crowd outside doesn't leave. What you need to understand about Roman royal weddings is that they were never designed for the couple. Every element, from the ceremony at sunset to the procession through the forum to this final, terrible moment, served as public theater where the state demonstrated control over its most valuable resource, bloodlines. Elite marriages weren't about love or even partnership. They were contractual mergers where a young woman's fertility became collateral, her virginity a form of currency, and her wedding night a transaction that required witnesses to be legally binding. The bride, typically between 13 and 16 years old, had been prepared for this moment through whispered warnings from older women, cryptic advice from midwives, and the kind of strategic ignorance that kept her compliant. She wasn't told what would happen. She was told what would happen if she failed. The husband, often decades older, enters the chamber with an audience that extends beyond the physical. Roman architects had perfected something chilling, the design of surveillance built directly into palace bedrooms. Recent archaeological excavations of elite Roman homes have uncovered narrow passages between walls, small apertures concealed behind decorative panels, and alcoves positioned at angles that suggest intentional observation points. These weren't security measures. These were viewing galleries. Because what happened on a wedding night wasn't merely a private consummation. It was a political act requiring verification by the state, the family, and whatever gods were invoked to bless the union. She can hear them breathing on the other side of the wall. But the watchers aren't the worst part. The worst part is the white linen stretched across the bed, pristine, expensive, and placed there specifically to capture evidence. This is the lintemen, the proof sheet, and it carries more weight than any marriage contract. Roman law, particularly the Lex Julia enacted under Augustus, had codified expectations around sexual purity with surgical precision. A bride's virginity wasn't assumed, it had to be demonstrated. Medical texts from the period, including works attributed to Soranus of Ephesus, describe the natural rupture expected during first intercourse and the subsequent bleeding that proves the seal unbroken. The language is clinical. The reality was savage. By morning, that sheet would be examined by midwives trained in forensic assessment of bodily fluids. They would look for volume, color, placement. They would smell it, sometimes taste it, to distinguish menstrual blood from virginal blood, from any other substance a desperate girl might use to fake the evidence. If the proof was deemed sufficient, the sheet would be displayed hung from the balcony, carried through the household, sometimes even paraded through nearby streets, as confirmation that the marriage was legitimate and the family honor intact. If there was no blood or insufficient blood, or blood that seemed suspicious, the bride faced immediate consequences ranging from divorce and public shaming to accusations of prior adultery, which carried penalties including exile, enslavement, or execution. Here's what makes this even more horrifying. Modern gynecology has established that roughly half of all women don't bleed during first intercourse. The hymen varies dramatically in thickness and elasticity. Some women are born without one. Physical activity, medical conditions, even the angle of penetration, dozens of variables determine whether bleeding occurs. But Roman physicians didn't know this. Or if they did, they didn't care. The blood wasn't really about anatomy. It was about control. It was about ensuring that every woman entering marriage understood that her body was no longer hers. It was evidence, property, a vessel to be inspected and approved. So some queens adapted the only way they could. They hurt themselves. Palace inventories from the era list curious items among bridal trousseaux: small bronze pins, thin blades described as cosmetic implements, vials of sheep's blood or red dye. These weren't beauty products. They were insurance policies. Women would cut the inside of their thighs, puncture their own tissue, or apply animal blood to ensure the sheets showed what the examiners expected to see. The physical pain was preferable to the social death that awaited those who failed the test. And if you're thinking this sounds barbaric, consider that variations of virginity testing continued in some cultures well into the 20th century, always under the same logic. A woman's word about her own body is never sufficient. Evidence must be extracted. But even if the blood appeared, even if the examination was passed, the trauma of that night was only beginning. Roman wedding ceremonies incorporated a ritual called the raptio, a dramatic reenactment of the legendary abduction of the Sabine women, one of Rome's founding myths. According to the story, early Romans, lacking wives, invited the neighboring Sabine tribe to a festival, then violently kidnapped their daughters and forced them into marriage. This wasn't a cautionary tale about assault. This was a proud origin story celebrated in art, poetry, and eventually wedding tradition. During the ceremony, the groom would literally chase the bride, who was expected to run, scream, and struggle. Guests would form a gauntlet, cheering as she was caught, lifted, and carried across the threshold, a symbolic recreation of conquest. The bride's resistance wasn't seen as genuine protest. It was considered good luck, proof that she was properly modest and therefore valuable. But when the door closed and the performance ended, the dynamic it represented didn't change. The groom's right to his wife's body was absolute. Under Roman law, specifically the concept of manus marriage, a husband gained near-total legal authority over his wife, similar to the power a father held over children. She became part of his household property. He could discipline her physically, control her movements, dictate her social contacts, and access her body whenever he chose. There was no legal concept of marital rape because rape was defined as a crime against property or honor, and a husband couldn't steal what he already owned. Wedding night accounts from the period, preserved in letters and later Christian critiques of pagan practices, described scenes that would constitute assault by any modern legal standard. Brides who froze in terror, brides who begged for gentleness and were ignored, brides who tried to negotiate delays and were physically restrained. One particularly chilling account from a noblewoman's letter describes hearing her younger sister sobbing through the walls while wedding guests outside made jokes about breaking in a virgin and wagered on how long the process would take. The psychological term we'd use now is conjugal assault under conditions of captivity. The term they used then was matrimonium, marriage, and through it all the crowd remained. The Romans had a specific tradition called epithalamium wedding songs performed outside the bridal chamber. But these weren't gentle lullabies. They were explicit, often vulgar chants describing the sexual acts happening inside, offering crude advice to the groom, mocking the bride's inexperience and fear. Poets like Catullus wrote famous examples filled with graphic imagery about penetration, jokes about the bride's anatomy, and encouragement for the husband to plow the field and tame the filly. These songs could continue for hours, growing louder and more explicit as the night wore on and wine flowed freely among the guests. Some accounts describe shifts of singers, with fresh groups arriving to replace those who'd grown hoarse, ensuring the couple never experienced a moment of silence or privacy. The psychological purpose was demolition. By reducing the bride's most vulnerable moment to entertainment, by making her pain and fear into punchlines, Roman society was teaching her the fundamental lesson of her new life. You are not a person with dignity. You are a function. Your feelings are secondary to your fertility, your fear less important than political alliance, your body a stage for other people's expectations. But even that wasn't the heaviest pressure crushing down on a queen that night. From the moment she entered that chamber, a biological countdown had begun. Roman queens were expected to conceive quickly, ideally within weeks, certainly within months. The succession of the empire, the security of political alliances, the justification for the marriage itself all depended on her producing an heir, not just any child, a son. Daughters were useful for future political marriages, but didn't secure a dynasty. A queen who failed to conceive, or who produced only daughters, or who miscarried, faced a spectrum of consequences from social humiliation to legal dissolution of the marriage to accusations of barrenness that could result in exile or worse. The morning after the wedding night, palace physicians would begin their assessments. They would question the bride about sensations, examine her for signs of conception, prescribe bizarre treatments based on humoral theory and sympathetic magic. She would be fed special foods, pomegranates for fertility, honey and milk to sweeten the womb, herbs that ranged from merely ineffective to actively toxic. Her menstrual cycles would be monitored with obsessive precision. If she bled on schedule, it meant failure. If she was late, it sparked hope that could transform into crushing disappointment. The medical understanding of reproduction was so primitive that physicians believed conception happened when male seed overpowered female moisture, and that a woman's thoughts during intercourse could physically shape the child. This meant queens were blamed not just for infertility, but for producing daughters, having weak sons, or giving birth to children with deformities. The stress itself became a medical crisis. Historical records describe queens developing what we'd now recognize as anxiety disorders, eating disorders, depression, and psychosomatic illness, all triggered by the impossible pressure of their wedding night